In this video, we will be looking at automating our survey requests. In the past video, we ran this function, batch survey language support, which started 3 surveys for us in our Twilio environment. But in order to start the next 3 surveys, we had to manually run that function again. Here we're going to be looking at how to automate that process so that you can let Google Sheets handle all of the batches for you. Now, real quickly, I just want to address, if we had, maybe hundreds of numbers in this column, we could theoretically just send all of those requests over at once and try to start those surveys. But we run into some issues with timeouts, potentially of our Google Scripts function, if it takes more than 30 seconds to start all those surveys. We also run into some risk when we're talking about interacting with our Twilio environment and the number of requests that we can handle for our Google Sheets. So just spacing this out over a longer period of time and automating the requests means that we're going to have fewer errors. And because we can automate it, we also are taking out the human component of having to sit here and wait to run more surveys. So let me walk through how this automation works. So this function, the batch survey language support, we talked about that in the past video. So if you need a reminder on what this function is doing, return to the last video. Right here are our helper functions. We also touched on those in our last video. So I'm going to go all the way down here to these 2 functions that help us automate this process. The first one here is function to automate sending batches of surveys. So you can see this is named Start Survey Batching with language, so we're supporting that language function here. We have another logger that just lets us know that this function has been called. Here I've set the interval to 1. This is going to be the number of minutes to wait between each batch. So in production, it might be good to set this at 4 or 5 minutes, especially if you're sending over larger batches of 20 or 30 or 40. For the purposes of this video, I'm just going to set it to 1. What we're going to do is we're going to trigger a batch every number of minutes. So in this case, every 1 minute. If I set this to 2, we'd be triggering that batch every 2 minutes. What we've told Google here is that we want a time-based trigger. We want it to go off every n number of minutes, and Google's actually going to create that trigger for us. So a trigger is something that Google Scripts manages, and I'll show you where you can actually view those triggers. We'll go Edit, Current Project Triggers. It'll open a new screen. And you can see a list of the triggers. Here we don't have any triggers at the moment, so we'll return to this once we've actually created that trigger and started running so we can see what that looks like. Okay, once we start a trigger, we also need to delete that trigger because we don't want this function to run in perpetuity. We want there to be a stopping point where Google Scripts is no longer sending over those batch functions. So that's what this function is going to do. Real simply, it just collects all of the project triggers. Since we only have 1 trigger, we don't need to worry about sort of managing multiple triggers. We're just going to get all of them. And then it will just go through, and for each one of those triggers, it will delete that, and that will stop the function from running. So let's actually go in here and start our trigger. Tools, macros, and here I'm going to run this function, Start Survey Batching with language. Okay, so you can see the script has finished. We don't have anything in our table yet since it takes a little bit of time for that trigger to start going. I'm going to go over here and just see what we have and refresh this page. Okay, so what you see is that now we have something in our list. It says that we have a time-based trigger, and it actually has the function that the trigger is supposed to run every time that 1 minute interval goes over. Here you can see that we've actually entered in that first batch. Like we saw in the last video, we have a next batch start here. It looks exactly the same. We have that response data that we're storing, and we're just waiting for this next batch to start. Yeah, if we pull up the sidebar, we can see a little bit more information. If I click on My Executions, I can actually see this function running. And whereas before this ran in response to the menu action, now it's running in response to a trigger action. So you can see the difference here. Now over here, recently we saw this next batch get started. So I didn't run the function, I didn't do anything. It was the trigger that took care of that. And we have 2 batches that have run, and we can see that this function's been invoked 2 times by the trigger. So in the next instance, we should be running one more survey, initiating one more survey, but then our list is up. So we want to make sure that in that case, the trigger is ended and we're not getting any more calls to this batch survey function. So I'm just going to go in here, look at my triggers again. Okay, and we can see that we now have an empty list of triggers, which means that that trigger has been deleted, which is exactly what we would want to see.